The traffic stop. James Richardson's day had been longer than usual. As the state's attorney general, long days were normal for him, but tonight felt different. The community meeting in the suburban neighborhood of Pine Grove had run late, discussing important issues about local law enforcement and community relations. Now, at 10:45 p.m., he just wanted to get home to his wife and kids. The streets were quiet as his black BMW set and cruised through the well-maintained neighborhoods. Richardson adjusted his tie, slightly loosened after 12 hours of wear. The radio played soft jazz, helping him unwind from the intense discussions of the evening. He had chosen to drive himself tonight, preferring the solitude after a day full of voices and opinions. In his rearview mirror, sudden flashing lights pierced the darkness. Richardson checked his speedometer. He was going exactly at the speed limit. With years of experience in law enforcement oversight, he knew exactly what to do. He turned on his right signal, carefully pulled over to the curb, and turned off his engine. His hands moved to the steering wheel, resting at the 10 and 2 o'clock positions. Officer Michael Brooks watched the BMW pull over smoothly. 12 years on the force had taught him to be suspicious of expensive cars in this neighborhood at this hour. He ran the plate before stepping out of his patrol car. The vehicle was registered to a James Richardson, but the address was from the wealthy part of town. "Something's not right here," Brooks muttered to himself, adjusting his body camera. He approached the driver's side window, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The man inside was black, wearing an expensive suit. Brooks' hand instinctively moved closer to his weapon. "License and registration," Brooks demanded, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. He noticed the driver's steady hands as they moved slowly towards the glove compartment. "Good evening, officer," Richardson responded calmly, his deep voice carrying years of courtroom experience. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Brooks' flashlight beam remained fixed on Richardson's face. "You failed to signal a lane change back there. License and registration, please." Richardson knew he had signaled. It was a habit so ingrained he did it even on empty streets. But he also knew this wasn't the time to argue. He reached for his wallet, movements deliberate and slow, aware of the officer's tense posture. "Here you are, officer," Richardson said, handing over his license and the registration he'd retrieved from the glove compartment. He noticed Officer Brooks' nameplate in the flashlight's reflection, making a mental note. Brooks studied the documents with his flashlight. The license photo matched, but something made him uneasy. The address was in Highland Park, the most expensive area in the state. The registration was in order, but why would someone from Highland Park be driving through Pine Grove at this hour? "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Brooks ordered, his free hand now resting openly on his holstered weapon. Richardson's heart rate increased slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Officer Brooks, may I ask why you need me to step out? I was driving within the speed limit, and I did use my turn signal." "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Step out of the vehicle now." Brooks's voice took on a harder edge. He clicked his flashlight off but kept it gripped tightly. Richardson knew his rights as both a citizen and the state's attorney general. He also knew that at this moment, Officer Brooks saw neither. What he saw was a black man in an expensive car, questioning his authority. "Officer, I'm reaching for my state government ID," Richardson said clearly, moving his hand slowly toward his suit jacket's inner pocket. "Hands where I can see them," Brooks barked, unsnapping his holster. "Exit the vehicle immediately." Through his side mirror, Richardson saw Brooks had shifted his stance, prepared for confrontation. In that moment, he had a choice to make: reveal his position as Attorney General or comply and address this through proper channels later. As two more patrol cars turned onto the street, their lights painting the scene in red and blue, Richardson realized this traffic stop was about to become much more than a simple misunderstanding. Escalation. The red and blue lights from 3 police cars now lit up the quiet suburban street like a carnival. Neighbors began peeking through their curtains, curious about the commotion on their usually peaceful road. Officer Brooks stood rigid, his hand still on his weapon, as James Richardson slowly opened his car door. "Hands where I can see them," Brooks shouted again, his voice echoing in the night air. "Step out slowly and face the vehicle." Richardson emerged from his BMW with the practiced calm of someone who had spent decades in high-pressure situations. At 6 feet tall, he purposefully made his movements smaller, less threatening. His expensive suit jacket pulled slightly as he raised his hands to shoulder height. "Officer Brooks," Richardson said evenly, "I want to cooperate fully, but I need to inform you. Face the vehicle. Hands on the hood." Brooks cut him off, moving closer. 2 more officers approached from their patrol cars, hands ready on their weapons. Richardson complied, placing his palms flat on the hood of his car. The metal felt cool against his hands, and he could see his reflection in the polished black surface. In it, he watched the 3 officers approach, the shadows stretching long in the emergency lights. "Spread your legs," Brooks ordered, moving to pat him down. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" "I'm returning home from a community meeting," Richardson replied calmly. "If you'll allow me to reach into my jacket pocket, I can show you my credentials." Officer Sarah Chen, one of the responding officers, stood slightly back, watching the scene unfold. Something about the man's composure struck her as unusual. Most people in this situation showed fear or anger, but this man displayed the confidence of someone very familiar with law enforcement procedures. "We'll get to your pockets," Brooks said sharply. "First, explain why you were driving so erratically." "I wasn't driving erratically, Officer Brooks," Richardson responded, maintaining his professional tone. "I followed all traffic laws and used my turn signal properly. Your dash cam footage will confirm this." Brooks paused for a moment, thrown off by the mention of dash cam footage. Most civilians didn't think about that detail during a stop. His suspicion deepened. "Listen here," Brooks said, stepping closer. "I don't need some smart mouth telling me how to do my job. I saw what I saw." The 3rd officer, Dave Martinez, shifted uncomfortably. Something wasn't adding up. The suspect's car was high-end, his suit looked expensive, and his manner of speaking suggested education and authority. "Officer," Richardson tried one more time, "I understand you're doing your job, but this stop is unnecessary. I am a state official, and my ID will confirm." "Oh, now you're a state official?" Brooks scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I'm the governor. Stop talking and spread your legs wider." Richardson complied but continued speaking in a clear, measured voice. "Under state law, you need probable cause for a search. A supposed failure to signal, which your dashcam will disprove, does not constitute—" "That's it," Brooks snapped, pulling his handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting an officer." Officer Chen stepped forward. "Sir, maybe we should." "Stay back," Brooks ordered. "I've got this under control." The cool metal of the handcuffs clicked around Richardson's wrists as more neighbors emerged from their homes, cell phones raised to record the scene. Some recognized the man being arrested, their whispers carrying across front lawns. "Isn't that the Attorney General?" "You're making a serious mistake, Officer Brooks," Richardson said quietly as the cuffs tightened. "I suggest you check my credentials before this goes any further." But Brooks was already reciting the Miranda rights, his voice carrying across the now crowded street. Officer Chen exchanged worried glances with Martinez as they watched their colleague march the well-dressed man toward the patrol car. As Richardson was led away from his BMW, he caught sight of a teenage boy recording everything on his phone from a nearby porch. He gave a slight nod, knowing that by morning, this incident would be more than just a simple traffic stop gone wrong. It would become a spotlight on the very issues he'd been discussing at the community meeting hours earlier. The arrest. The back seat of Officer Brooks' patrol car smelled of stale coffee and desperation. James Richardson sat straight-backed despite the handcuffs, his mind already working through the legal implications of what was unfolding. Through the window, he could see his BMW getting smaller as they pulled away, Officer Martinez staying behind to supervise its towing. "Booking's going to love this one," Brooks muttered to himself, glancing in the rearview mirror at his prisoner. The man's continued calmness unsettled him, but he pushed the feeling aside. He'd arrested plenty of people who thought they were too important for the law. At the precinct, the night shift desk sergeant, Tom Wilson, looked up as Brooks led Richardson through the doors. Wilson's 20 years on the force had taught him to read people quickly, and something about this arrest felt off. "What we got, Brooks?" Wilson asked, taking in Richardson's expensive suit and dignified bearing. "Disorderly conduct and resisting an officer," Brooks reported, standing straighter, refused to cooperate during a routine traffic stop. Richardson spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of authority even in custody. "Sergeant, if you'll check my inside jacket pocket, you'll find my credentials. I'm—" "Quiet," Brooks interrupted. "You've caused enough trouble tonight." Sergeant Wilson frowned. "Let's see those credentials, Brooks. Do a proper search." Brooks reluctantly reached into Richardson's jacket pocket, pulling out a leather wallet. As he opened it, his face went pale. There, in clear official lettering, was a state government ID identifying James Richardson as the Attorney General. "Is there a problem, Officer Brooks?" Richardson asked calmly. Wilson stepped around his desk for a closer look. His eyes widened as he read the ID. "Oh, hell," he muttered, then raised his voice. "Remove those cuffs, Brooks. Now." But Sarge, he was resisting. "Remove the cuffs." Wilson's voice echoed through the booking area, drawing attention from other officers. As Brooks fumbled with the handcuff keys, Officer Chen burst through the doors. "Sergeant, you need to see this. The arrest is already on social media, and the news vans are on their way." Wilson ran a hand over his face. "Mr. Attorney General, sir, I cannot express how." "Save it, Sergeant," Richardson interrupted, rubbing his wrists as the cuffs came off. "I'd like to make a phone call, and then we can discuss this situation properly." The booking area had gone silent. Officers who had been processing other arrests stopped to stare. Brooks stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and growing fear as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Richardson walked to the phone on the wall, aware of every eye in the room following him. He dialed a number from memory, waiting as it rang. "Judge Martinez? James Richardson here." "Yes, at this hour. I'm actually at the Pine Grove police station." "No, not for a case. I've been arrested." He paused, listening. "Yes, that's correct. Would you mind coming down? I think we need to address this immediately." Brooks slumped against the booking desk, his bravado completely deflated. Officer Chen shook her head in disbelief as she watched the scene unfold. "Sir," Wilson tried again, "we can release you immediately. There's no need to involve a judge." Richardson turned, his expression stern but composed. "Actually, Sergeant, there is every need. What happened tonight is exactly what I was discussing at the community meeting earlier, the very reason I was in that neighborhood. This isn't about me anymore." The main doors opened again as Captain Sarah Roberts, the night commander, rushed in, still pulling on her uniform jacket. She must have been called from home. "Mr. Attorney General," she said, breathless, "I just got word. This is completely unacceptable, unfortunate, a mistake." Richardson finished for her. "Captain Roberts, this is an opportunity. In about 30 minutes, Judge Martinez will be here. I suggest you gather any officers involved in this incident, pull all body cam footage, and prepare the dash cam video from Officer Brooks' vehicle." Brooks, still standing by the booking desk, looked like he might be sick. "Oh, and Captain," Richardson added, straightening his tie, "you might want to call your media relations team. There are several news vans pulling into your parking lot right now. I believe we're about to have a very public conversation about police procedures in our state." Through the station windows, camera lights began to flash, illuminating the night like lightning before a storm. Night in custody. The holding cell was clean but cold. James Richardson sat on the metal bench, his suit jacket folded neatly beside him. Through the glass wall, he watched the chaos he had sparked unfold like a well-planned chess game. Captain Roberts paced back and forth in the main area, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, Mayor Thompson. Yes, I understand the severity. No, sir, I don't know how this happened. The Attorney General is still here by his own choice." Officer Brooks sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen as he tried to write his incident report for the third time. Each version seemed worse than the last. His hands shook slightly as he typed. "Brooks," Captain Roberts called out. "Where is that dash cam footage?" "Still downloading, Captain," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The system is running slow." In the cell, Richardson closed his eyes, remembering a similar night 30 years ago when he was just a law student. That time, there had been no badge to save him, no title to shield him. Just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The memory strengthened his resolve. Judge Martinez arrived at 1:15 a.m., still wearing his golf shirt under his hastily donned suit jacket. The night guard almost didn't let him in until Captain Roberts intervened. "James," the judge called out, approaching the cell. "You don't have to stay in there. I can order your release right now." Richardson stood up, straightening his tie. "Actually, Marcus, I do need to stay. At least for a few more hours. Have you seen the social media response?" The judge held up his phone. The video of Richardson's arrest had gone viral, with over 1 million views already. #Attorney General arrested was trending nationwide. "This is bigger than me now," Richardson continued. "Let's see what the morning shift brings." Outside the station, the media circus had grown. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching into the night sky like maple trees. Reporters stood in front of bright lights, speaking into cameras about racial profiling, police accountability, and the shocking arrest of the state's top law enforcement official. Inside, Officer Chen brought Richardson a cup of coffee through the cell's food slot. "Sir," she said quietly, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner during the stop." Richardson accepted the coffee with a nod. "Officer Chen, sometimes staying quiet lets the truth speak louder. Your body cam footage will tell its own story." At 3 a.m., Captain Roberts received another call. Her face paled as she listened. "Yes, Governor." "No, sir, the Attorney General is still here." "Yes, he's refusing to leave." "I understand, sir. First thing in the morning." The night shift workers moved through their duties like actors in a play, hyper-aware of their audience behind the glass. Richardson watched as Officer Brooks was called into the captain's office 3 times, emerging looking more defeated each time. Around 4 a.m., Richardson's wife arrived, escorted by 2 state troopers. Lisa Richardson, a federal judge herself, took one look at her husband through the glass and understood exactly what he was doing. "The kids?" he asked as she approached the cell. "With my sister," she replied. "James, you're making quite a statement here." He smiled slightly. Sometimes the best lessons are taught in silence. Lisa touched the glass between them. "The governor called me. He's furious that you're choosing to stay in the cell." "Good," Richardson replied. "That means this is working. How many other innocent people have sat in cells like this, with no power to change the system?" Through the windows, the sky began to lighten. The night shift officers prepared to hand over to the morning crew, their reports carefully written and rewritten. Officer Brooks had been ordered to stay, his shift extended by the captain. As dawn approached, Richardson put his suit jacket back on and straightened his appearance. He knew the morning would bring more cameras, more questions, and more opportunities for change. In a few hours, he would walk into a courtroom, not as a suspect, but as both a victim and a prosecutor of a broken system. The night in custody was ending, but the real work was about to begin. Morning revelations. At exactly 6 a.m., Police Chief David Morgan burst through the station doors. His usually neat uniform was slightly wrinkled, suggesting he'd dressed in a hurry. The night shift officers snapped to attention, while Captain Roberts rushed to meet him. "Where is he?" Chief Morgan demanded, his voice echoing through the station. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on the holding cell where James Richardson sat, looking as composed as if he were in his own office. "Oh my God," Morgan whispered, seeing the Attorney General behind glass. "Get him out of there. Now." "Sir," Captain Roberts began, "Mr. Richardson has declined tow." "Declined?" Morgan's face reddened. "He's the Attorney General of this state. He shouldn't have been in there in the first place." Officer Brooks, who had been dozing at his desk, jerked awake at the chief's voice. His face went pale as he watched Morgan storm toward the holding cell. "Mr. Attorney General," Morgan said, his voice softer now, "I cannot express my deepest—" "Save the apologies, Chief," Richardson interrupted, standing up. "We have more important matters to discuss. Is Officer Brooks still here?" Brooks tried to shrink behind his computer screen, but Morgan spotted him. Brooks, front and center. Walking to the chief felt like the longest journey of Brooks' life. Each step brought him closer to the man he'd wrongfully arrested, the man who could end his career with a single word. The entire station watched in tense silence. "Officer Brooks," Richardson said calmly, "do you know who I am now?" Yes, sir, Brooks managed to say, his voice barely audible. You're the Attorney General. And last night? I didn't know, sir. I just thought. Brooks trailed off, realizing every explanation would only make things worse. Richardson stepped out of the cell, straightening his tie. You thought you saw a black man in an expensive car in the wrong neighborhood. Isn't that right, Officer Brooks? The silence in the station was deafening. Outside, the morning news crews had multiplied, their cameras trained on the building's entrance. The story had gone national overnight. Sir, Brooks started again, I was just following procedure. Were you? Richardson's voice carried the weight of his office now. Let's review that procedure, shall we? Captain Roberts, do you have the dash cam footage ready? Roberts nodded, leading them to a nearby computer. The footage played clearly, showing Richardson's car making a proper signal before changing lanes. There was no traffic violation. Chief Morgan watched the video, his jaw tightening. Brooks, what were you thinking? But the neighborhood? Brooks stopped, suddenly hearing how his words would sound. The neighborhood where I was leading a community meeting about police reform, Richardson finished for him. The irony isn't lost on me, Officer Brooks. Through the station windows, they could see more news vans arriving. Local community leaders were gathering outside, holding signs and giving interviews. The story was becoming a symbol of everything wrong with policing in America. Chief Morgan, Richardson said, turning to face him, I could demand Officer Brooks' badge right now. I could file charges. I could make an example of him and this department. Brooks seemed to stop breathing. Morgan tensed, preparing for the worst. But that's not why I stayed here all night, Richardson continued. I stayed because this isn't about one officer or one wrongful arrest. This is about a system that needs to change. He walked to the window, watching the growing crowd outside. In an hour, I'll walk out those doors and face the cameras. They'll want me to call for firing and arrests. Instead, I'm going to announce a complete review of this department's practices, with Officer Brooks' case as the starting point. Brooks looked up, confusion mixing with relief on his face. You're not firing me. Richardson turned back to face him. No, Officer Brooks, I'm going to make you part of the solution. You're going to help me show every officer in this state what happens when bias overshadows judgment and how we can do better. As the morning sun streamed through the windows, Richardson gathered his belongings, preparing to face the media. Behind him, Officer Brooks sat heavily in a chair, the weight of his actions and their consequences finally sinking in. The night of mistakes was over, but the day of change was just beginning. The county courthouse buzzed with energy at 9 a.m. Every seat in courtroom 302 was filled, with reporters and community members squeezed together on the wooden benches. Judge Sarah Thompson, known for her no-nonsense approach, entered the courtroom and paused briefly at the sight before her. At the defendant's table sat James Richardson, the state's attorney general, representing himself. He wore a fresh suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had argued hundreds of cases in rooms just like this. Officer Brooks sat at the prosecutor's table with the district attorney, looking like he hadn't slept in days. All rise, the bailiff called out. The room rustled as everyone stood. Be seated, Judge Thompson said, adjusting her glasses. This is the arraignment hearing for case number 2025 CR 1542, Pine Grove Police Department versus James Richardson. She paused, looking directly at Officer Brooks. Though I must say, this is the first time I've seen the Attorney General as a defendant in my courtroom. Richardson stood, buttoning his suit jacket. Your Honor, I'll be representing myself in this matter. So noted, the judge replied. Though I must ask, are you sure that's wise, Mr. Attorney General? A small smile crossed Richardson's face. Your Honor, I believe it's most appropriate in this case. I move to dismiss all charges, and I'm prepared to present evidence showing not just my innocence, but a pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed. The district attorney, Mark Stevens, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been called in early that morning and given an impossible task: prosecute the state's highest-ranking law enforcement official on charges that were clearly baseless. Your Honor, Stevens began, given the circumstances, the state would be willing to. The state would be willing to what, Mr. Stevens? Richardson interrupted politely. Drop the charges quietly, sweep this incident under the rug, He turned to face the crowded courtroom. That's exactly what we're not going to do today. Richardson walked to the evidence table and picked up a USB drive. Your Honor, I'd like to present 3 pieces of evidence. The dash cam footage from Officer Brooks' vehicle, the body cam footage from Officers Brooks, Chen, and Martinez, and statistical data on traffic stops in Pine Grove over the last 5 years. Judge Thompson nodded. Proceed, Mr. Richardson. The courtroom lights dimmed as the dash cam footage played on the large screen. The video clearly showed Richardson's car signaling before changing lanes. Officer Brooks squirmed in his seat as his own voice filled the courtroom, growing increasingly aggressive despite Richardson's calm responses. As you can see, Your Honor, Richardson said after the footage ended, there was no traffic violation, no probable cause for the stop. He clicked to the next piece of evidence. Now, let's examine the body cam footage. For the next 20 minutes, Richardson methodically presented his case. The body cameras showed multiple angles of the arrest, each one making it increasingly clear that the only crime had been driving while black in an affluent neighborhood. And finally, Richardson said, pulling up a series of graphs, "These are the department's own statistics on traffic stops. Notice anything interesting about the racial breakdown of drivers stopped in Pine Grove compared to the demographic makeup of the area?" The numbers told a clear story. The disparity was impossible to ignore. Your Honor, Richardson concluded, I move not only to dismiss these charges but to enter these statistics into the public record. The people deserve to know. Judge Thompson removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. Mr. Stevens, does the state wish to respond? The district attorney stood slowly. No, Your Honor. The state moves to dismiss all charges. Granted, Judge Thompson said firmly. Charges dismissed. She looked directly at Officer Brooks. Officer, I suggest you pay close attention to what happens next. It's not often we get a learning opportunity of this magnitude. As the gavel struck the bench, Richardson gathered his materials. He paused by Officer Brooks' table on his way out. Officer Brooks, he said quietly, my office tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp. We have work to do. The courtroom erupted in conversation as Richardson walked out, cameras flashing and reporters shoving questions. Behind him, Officer Brooks sat motionless, the full impact of the morning's events finally sinking in. His mistake hadn't just been exposed, it was about to become a catalyst for change. The AF. 1 week after the courtroom hearing, the Attorney General's office was busier than ever. James Richardson sat at his desk, reviewing the preliminary findings from his department's investigation into the Pine Grove Police Department. The stack of reports painted a troubling picture of systemic issues that went far beyond one traffic stop. His assistant knocked on the door. Sir, Officer Brooks is here for his 9 a.m. meeting. Richardson looked up from the papers. Send him in, Susan. Officer Michael Brooks entered the office, looking different from the confident officer who had made the arrest 2 weeks ago. He wore his uniform, freshly pressed, but his shoulders carried the weight of someone who had faced his own prejudices and found them wanting. Take a seat, Officer Brooks, Richardson said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Have you seen the morning news? Brooks nodded slowly. Yes, sir, the governor's announcement about the new police reform bill. A bill that wouldn't exist if you hadn't pulled me over that night, Richardson said, leaning back in his chair. Sometimes, Officer Brooks, our biggest mistakes can lead to our most important work. He pushed a folder across the desk. Inside were statistics from police departments across the state, traffic stops, arrests, use of force incidents, all broken down by race and neighborhood. What do you see? Richardson asked. Brooks studied the numbers, his face growing more troubled with each page. The same pattern, sir. It's everywhere, not just in Pine Grove. Exactly. Richardson stood and walked to his office window. Below, protesters still gathered daily, holding signs demanding police reform. But now, something was different. Police officers had begun joining the crowds, showing support for change. Your dashboard camera footage has been viewed 17 million times. Richardson continued. It's being used in police training sessions across the country. People are finally seeing what many of us have experienced our entire lives. Brooks shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sir, I've been thinking a lot about that night. About all the other times I made assumptions based on. He trailed off. Based on race, Richardson finished for him. It's okay to say it, Officer Brooks. We can't fix what we won't acknowledge. The phone on Richardson's desk buzzed. Sir, the police chiefs from Atlanta and Chicago are on line 1. They want to discuss implementing your new training program. Tell them I'll call back. Richardson replied. He turned back to Brooks. That's why I asked you here today. I'm forming a special task force to oversee police reform implementation across the state. I want you on it. Brooks looked up in surprise. Me? But sir, after what I did. Because of what you did, Richardson corrected him. And more importantly, because of what you've learned since then. You've spent the last 2 weeks studying bias in policing, haven't you? Yes, sir. I couldn't sleep anyway, so I've been reading everything I could find. Richardson nodded approvingly. The task force will work directly with departments to implement new training protocols, review procedures, and monitor progress. We need officers who understand both sides of this issue, officers who have faced their own biases and chosen to change. Outside the office, phones rang constantly as media requests poured in from around the world. The story had sparked a national conversation about police reform and Richardson's approach. Focusing on systemic change rather than punishment had caught people's attention. What do you say, Officer Brooks? Richardson asked. Ready to help make real change? Brooks stood, straightening his uniform. Yes, sir. I want to make this right, not just for what happened with you, but for everyone who's been profiled like that. Richardson extended his hand. Welcome to the task force, then. We start tomorrow. The governor's office is announcing the initiative at noon. As Brooks left the office, Richardson returned to the window. The crowd below had grown larger. Signs reading Justice for All and Reform Now waved alongside police officers shaking hands with community members. His phone buzzed again. Sir, the White House is calling. They want to discuss implementing your reform program nationally. Richardson smiled. What had started as a routine traffic stop was becoming a movement. Sometimes, he thought, the best changes come from the worst moments. Put them through, he said, turning back to his desk. We have work to do. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and the Pine Grove Community Center was packed to capacity. On stage, Attorney General James Richardson stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd of faces, community members, police officers, politicians, and media representatives from across the nation. 6 months ago, I was handcuffed less than a mile from this spot. Richardson began, his voice carrying through the hall. Today, I'm proud to announce that our state has become a national model for police reform. In the front row, Officer Michael Brooks sat in his dress uniform, a new pin on his collar marking him as a member of the Police Reform Task Force. Beside him sat Officer Chen, who had recently been promoted to lead the department's new Community Relations Unit. The numbers tell a powerful story, Richardson continued, clicking to the first slide of his presentation. Traffic stops based on racial profiling have decreased by 70%. Civilian complaints are down by 60%, but most importantly, public trust in law enforcement has increased dramatically. The screen showed graphs and charts, but the real evidence was in the room itself. Police officers and community members sitting together, talking, sharing ideas. The tension that had filled these meetings 6 months ago had been replaced by something new: hope. Officer Brooks, Richardson said, would you join me on stage? Brooks walked up, no longer the nervous officer who had faced judgment in that courtroom. His experience had transformed him, and his story had become a powerful tool for change. 6 months ago, Officer Brooks made a mistake that could have ended his career, Richardson told the audience. Instead, it became the catalyst for the most comprehensive police reform program in our nation's history. Brooks stepped to the podium. I was wrong that night, he said simply. But through the Attorney General's leadership, I learned that admitting our mistakes is only the first step. The real work comes in making sure those mistakes never happen again. He turned to face the rows of police officers in the audience. We've all completed the new training program. We've all learned about implicit bias and its impact on our work. But more than that, we've learned to see the communities we serve as partners, not adversaries. The presentation continued, showing footage from the new police training programs that have been implemented across the state. Officers were now required to spend time in the communities they patrolled, attending local events, meeting with residents, and building relationships before they ever put on a badge. But perhaps the most significant change, Richardson said, returning to the podium, is in the numbers we don't see. He clicked to a new slide. These are the traffic stops that didn't happen, the confrontations that were avoided, the lives that weren't disrupted by bias and assumption. In the audience, Captain Roberts nodded. Her department had become a training ground for officers from across the country, eager to learn from their experience. Last week, Richardson continued, I received calls from 12 other states asking to implement our program. The White House has formed a committee to take these changes national. What happened in Pine Grove didn't end here. It was just the beginning. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. Change isn't easy. It requires us to face uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society. But real change is possible when we choose to learn from our mistakes rather than deny them. As the presentation ended, Richardson and Brooks stood together on stage, shaking hands. No longer the arresting officer and his wrongfully detained suspect, but partners in a movement that was transforming law enforcement across the nation. Outside the community center, news crews captured the scene as police officers and local residents gathered in small groups, discussing the changes they'd witnessed. Children played safely on the streets where tensions had once run high. Patrol cars drove by with windows down, officers waving to residents who waved back. 6 months ago, I sat in a cell to make a point, Richardson said to Brooks as they watched the crowd disperse. Today, we're making history. Brooks smiled, touching the task force pin on his collar. Thank you, sir, for showing me that one mistake doesn't have to define us. It's what we learn from it that matters. As the sun set over Pine Grove, the community center slowly emptied, but the impact of that night 6 months ago continued to ripple outward, changing lives, changing policies, and most importantly, changing minds. The traffic stop that could have ended in tragedy had instead become a turning point, proof that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes.